I'm talking with Kristin Du Mez, author of the hit New York Times bestseller, Jesus and John Wayne. She's got a new film out, For Our Daughters, which premieres on the MeidasTouch Network tonight. Here's the trailer. It will make your jaw drop. My conversation with Kristin is right after.
Women will be happy, healthy, confident, and free. Because I am your protector. I want to be your protector. As president, I have to be your protector.
A jury in New York has found that Trump sexually abused and defamed E. Jean Carroll and awarded her $5 million in damages.
In a unanimous, historic verdict, he's been found guilty of 34 separate charges after he paid off a porn star.
You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything.
Kristin, why did you feel moved to make this film?
We thought it was important to bring to all Americans the insights from women who have lived inside Christian nationalist spaces, women who have lived inside conservative Christian churches, who have stories to tell about what happens when you give men unchecked power over them. And the stories are harrowing, stories of sexual abuse, stories of cover-up. And this has been going on for decades now inside conservative evangelical churches. And we thought it was time to expose this both to those inside those churches and to all Americans, because the same people who are promoting this rigid patriarchy and subjecting women inside their churches are the very men who are pressing a Christian nationalist agenda that is really on the ballot this November.
You've had a really astonishing run of in-person screenings, a lot of them in churches, in faith communities before this MeidasTouch Network premiere. How have those gone? Because you've attended some of those. You have talked to survivors. You've talked to faith leaders. What's the reception been like?
It has been overwhelmingly positive, so moving. Hundreds of people are coming to watch, and afterwards, women are just lined up to tell their own stories. It is heartbreaking, but it is also time. It is time to tell these stories. And, you know, some of these stories have been held closely for more than half a century. Women in their 60s, 70s, 80s coming up to me and saying, this is also my story. Fathers saying and grandfathers saying, now I have an understanding of what my daughter or granddaughter went through. So it is deeply disturbing, but also cathartic to finally expose these stories.
Is the connection to politics apparent and alive in these rooms? In past conversations about this, there has been a wall between the abuse scandals and the politics of the moment, whatever moment that is we're living through. I think they're inextricably linked now because of the Christian nationalist movement.
Yeah, you know, at first I wondered if we weren't going to get a lot of pushback from Christians themselves, who maybe were on board. Let's talk about abuse. Let's dig into that, but just don't mix politics in with this. But the whole reason I came upon stories of abuse in evangelicalism is because I was researching evangelical views of masculinity, patriarchy linked with Christian nationalism. And what I saw is one after another of the preachers who were promoting this militant patriarchy became embroiled in scandal, abuse of power, and sexual abuse. And so I came to the issue of abuse through a political framing. And there's a reason for that. In the film, you see men who were either perpetrators or frequently covered up the abuse of their friends. And these are some of the most powerful religious figures over the last half century. People like Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler, Jerry Vines, from decades ago, kind of the first wave of Christian nationalism, if you will, the Moral Majority, Council for National Policy, and so on. These are the same men who are trying to essentially take back the country and turn America into their idea of a Christian nation. More recently, figures like Doug Wilson and Joel Webbon, these are men who have direct links to Project 2025 and to our current kind of Christian nationalist takeover. And so the facts are all right there in front of us. And underlying all of this is a common ideology that essentially seizing power over others, power over women, power over children, and the ends will always justify the means, power over the country.
Abuse scandals within the church are not new. And you talk about how cathartic this film is for survivors whose experiences go back decades. But something has changed of late. Can you give voice to this shift within these evangelical communities and the power and the outspokenness that the misogynists feel now? How has that changed in just the last few years?
A couple of things have changed. One very important change is with the help of social media, survivors can tell their stories and other people can hear their stories, including other survivors. And that has really changed the game because for so long, so many survivors thought they were alone, thought this was all, it just happened to them. It was an aberration. This was a one-off and something went terribly wrong. And now they're starting to see that this is not a one-off, that this is a systemic problem and the cover-up is absolutely systemic. And so they're raising their voices and it is no longer possible to keep these stories secret. That's really important. But also what we're seeing is kind of the blatant abandonment of any pretense to being the moral majority, if you will. A wholesale embrace of Donald Trump within many of these circles. It's just a more ruthless politics. And that's really laid bare as well. And so while I anticipated there would have been some pushback against this political framing, people might think I'm politicizing this issue. I've actually been very surprised how little of that response I've gotten because I think people can see it for themselves.
You talk about the abandonment of this idea of a moral majority that goes hand in hand with the embrace of Trump. But I observed a corollary to that, which is less the abandonment of Christian ideals than the twisting of them and recasting Jesus himself as a warrior Christ, as a toxically masculine figure. I mean, if you just Google warrior Christ or Trump and Jesus, I mean, the images will give you nightmares. So I think it's probably some type of psychological adaptation that is allowing some of these extremist Christians to maintain the pretense of Christianity by redefining it, by redefining who Jesus was, so it aligns with their loyalty to Trump. Is that fair?
That is very fair. Yes, I should have phrased that slightly differently because so externally it becomes very clear if you're not kind of inside this space. If you still have kind of a critical standpoint, you can see that there's no morality here, not at all. Right? The abuse, the blame the victim, the brutal treatment of survivors and survivor advocates. I mean, it is really horrifying. So it's hard to call any of that moral. But you're right, very much so. On the inside of this, what you see is a redefining of what moral is. Moral means to fight because the enemy is out there and you're on God's side and God is on your side. And so really whatever you do is righteous. And you can see that inside these spaces. You can see that in terms of their politics. They have redefined Christianity itself. They have changed Jesus into this warrior Christ who really is just their mascot. They're going to do what they're going to do, but they're going to call it righteous and do it in Jesus' name. And it's just becoming more and more blatant. Before it was more subtle, perhaps. They're not subtle at all these days.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here to remind everyone, if you haven't yet subscribed to the podcast version of this show, please do. The link is below. And don't forget to rate and review. It makes a huge difference in how the algorithm ranks shows. Thanks for the support. I don't know if you saw clips of Trump's rally in Philly earlier this week, but he spent, I think, 39 minutes just standing aimlessly on stage at the end of that rally, listening to his playlist. It was very weird and alarming. And I bring that up because it means we have to talk about J.D. Vance, right?
Yes.
We have spent so much time talking about the threat that Donald Trump poses. We've linked him and his staff directly to Project 2025 and the dark vision that beholds for this country. But there is a very real possibility that the most powerful person in the world, should Trump win, isn't going to be Trump in a year. It's going to be J.D. Vance. Can you talk about his connections to this movement and the alarm bells that should be sounding?
Absolutely. So some of the Christian nationalist leaders certainly have connections to Trump, particularly to his former administration. But it's J.D. Vance where we see these connections much more tightly. So if you look, for example, at the president of the Heritage Foundation, right, the group that drafted Project 2025, Kevin Roberts, J.D. Vance wrote the foreword for his book, which we should be able to read right now, but we can't because the publisher decided to hold it back, presumably because it was so volatile that the powers that be determined that could actually hurt the Trump Vance ticket if Americans actually saw what they were supporting, what they had planned. But I mean, they're telling us every day. And when I read Project 2025, I see, Christian nationalist fingerprints all over that document. One of the most disturbing lines to me was the idea that the Constitution guarantees Americans the right to do what they ought to do, not what they want to do. Well, who determines that? Right? We know the answer to that, and we can see what that looks like inside these right-wing Christian spaces. Right? There are no women's rights. Women have the right to do what they're told.
Does all of this ambition, well, let me back up and just observe and get your reaction to this. The fact that their big strategic mistake was writing it all down. You said they're telling us every day. I mean, the extremists of old used to hide their extremism well enough that they could at least sneak into office. But they put it on paper. Project 2025 is a 970-odd page manifesto about what they intend to do to American democracy. Not sure what the question is, but it's just stunning to me that in their arrogance, in their ambition, they thought it would not be a problem to put this all down on paper for the rest of America to see.
Right. And I don't know, on the one hand, I find it somewhat refreshing that we are actually talking about issues, right? Right. We have it in front of us. We have 900 some pages of, very clear plans of what they would like. It's their wish list, but also the means to implement, which include completely overhauling the federal government to ensure that the executive has the power to do whatever the heck he wants to do.
And,
right?
and a compliant Supreme Court that is
the court will not save us.
Them.
Yes, exactly. So we can see that in front of us, and then we can see what they want to do with that power. Yes. So again, refreshing that we can actually talk about policies. We can talk about this. And what we know is across the board, these policies are not popular with the American public. That's why they need that power, right? Because the democratic processes are not going to get them where they want to be. So it all fits together, both the policies and the processes, and thoroughly anti-democratic there. However, it's also disturbing because they can put this out and they can say these things. And it's not just in Project 2025. Like, listen to what Trump is saying day in, day out on the campaign trail. Listen to what J.D. Vance says. Listen to some of those podcasts from Vance. He's been on a ton of podcasts and he's been very frank about his views on an array of issues. The disturbing thing to me is even when we have all of this right in front of us and we can see the explicit threat to democracy and what that portends and what it will mean for groups of Americans, we still have an incredibly close race, razor thin margins. And so that's also disturbing to me as an American who cares about our democracy. It's kind of stunning that this is where we find ourselves in 2024.
You did a podcast recently, and the thumbnail was titled, and I got to get your take on this, How Faith Destroyed Women's Rights. As an evangelical, as a believer, and as an advocate for women's rights, I'm sure you have a perspective on that might not align perfectly with the title of that show. Can you give us the context?
Yeah, I may have seen that in passing. There's so many thumbnails out there right now. So faith, we have to be a little bit more specific. What faith are we talking about? And even when we look at Christianity, even when we look at evangelicalism, as a historian, I can say, in fact, my first book was on the history of evangelical feminism going back more than a century. And so, there's faith, there's convictions, there's biblical interpretation, and it can go in many different directions. And there is a long history of Christian tradition of interpreting the words of the scriptures in ways that empower women, and a tradition of egalitarianism within evangelicalism. But I will say that in the last half century or so, that has very much been kind of moved to the minority position. And some of the most powerful factions within conservative evangelicalism and within the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in this country, have really embraced what they would call complementarianism or just straight up patriarchy. This hierarchical ordering of all of society with men at the top. And so, yes, that model is incompatible with women's rights as most of us understand them. They will simply redefine women's rights, that women have the right to be who God made them to be, which is subordinate.
Which is the topic of the film. Last question, and I want to circle back to that trailer we played at the top. Do the evangelicals you're writing about, the subjects of this film, do they still see Donald Trump as the useful idiot, the means to the end, or is he more of a messianic figure these days, or a Cyrus figure? Maybe not quite the reincarnation, the second coming, but has he taken on the attributes of a Christly figure for this community?
People like Trump for an array of reasons inside this community. For some, it still is an kind of transactional. Some, particularly influenced by charismatic strands of Christianity, definitely see him as a messianic figure. So you have that kind of powerful strand within the evangelical world. And you've got others who, like him, they'll just say more generally for his strength. Right. And he has explicitly courted them, promised them that he will not just protect Christianity, but that he will privilege Christianity, that he's going to put them ahead of everybody else. He's going to give them more power. He's chided them for not using the power that they have more effectively. And he's promised them that if I become president again, you're going to have more power than you've ever had before. And that's what many of them want to hear. And so the combination of all of those things means that we're still looking at, I think the latest polling puts it at 82% of white evangelicals plan to vote for Donald Trump.
Well, Kristin, it's always great talking to you. The film is For Our Daughters, and it premieres on the MeidasTouch Network tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.